If, like me, you are a nerd at an annoying age, you've probably tried to justify watching way too much anime to your parents. They got mad at you for spending all your time on Fairy Tail and Yu-Gi-Oh! So you hit them back with, "But I'm learning about Japanese culture," or "I'm learning another language." We weren't totally wrong to say that, but let's be honest, it's a pretty weak excuse. Inuyasha might take place during the Sengoku era, but it isn't exactly a stand-in for a history textbook, and I didn't treat it as such. That being said, these kinds of excuses might be kinda dumb in hindsight, but they do ask an interesting question. Is there a real tangible benefit to watching anime? Now, the real answer is, who cares? Even if anime or fiction as a whole provides you with some form of real-life benefit, acting like that's why we need art or something is kinda cynical. Stories are a fundamental part of the human experience. We shouldn't have to justify their existence, you know? This is a YouTube video, not a philosophy class though, so let's put that on the back burner. Even if we don't need a tangible benefit to weeb out, it can't hurt to talk about one. So, what can you gain from watching a lot of anime? Well, our earlier contenders don't hold up for long. Consuming media in a certain language is often really helpful for people learning it, but it's not the only or especially not the first step. Telenovelas might help someone who took Spanish in high school become fluent, but trying to learn just by raw-dogging Maria Mercedes probably won't go well. On a similar note, while consuming a place's fiction won't hurt your understanding of their culture or history, it's not exactly the ideal research technique. Like I said with Inuyasha, Vagabond is a great piece of historical fiction, but that doesn't mean reading it is a replacement for taking a class on Japanese history. Unfortunately for 13-year-old me, neither of these examples are good for much more than arguing with your mom, at least not on their own. Don't give up hope though, because I do think there is a real, tangible benefit to be gained from watching anime or reading manga. In fact, it's something that you can gain from basically any piece of fiction. Ideology. Writers tend to have opinions on the world that they live in, and so a lot of good art bundles at least a little bit of the creator's ideology in with the story. So is a lot of bad art, mind you, along with pieces that aren't even trying to say something, but we'll get back to that later. For now, the themes of a story almost always coincide, at least a little bit, with some part of the author's ideology. Then, because they usually want to instill those themes into the audience, engaging with a story is a great way to learn or even be convinced of a writer's opinions on the world. That's how this becomes the benefit of watching anime. Consuming a lot of stories can be a great way to microdose on a bunch of different ideologies, which is especially helpful when you're young and just starting to develop one that's not your parents'. Case in point, let's talk about a story that's so explicit about its ideology that some fans treat it like intellectual theory. Vinland Saga. Although he does take a while to actually introduce the idea, once it's in there, Makoto Yukimura takes every possible opportunity to advocate for pacifism through Vinland Saga. Don't get me wrong, he's no Ayn Rand, the manga is much more than an ill-disguised manifesto, but it's hard not to see the intended takeaway. Once our protagonist, Thorfinn Karl Senfi, internalizes all the harm that his culture of violence creates, he does all that he can to escape or end it. That leads to several monologues on the horrors of bloodshed and the importance of all other options. Let's go over the most famous one from near the end of Season 2. For context, Thorfinn is trying to use his status as one of King Canute's former guards to broker a peace, but he needs to confirm those credentials first. Any old schmuck could say they're a former royal guard, and he spent the last 4 years as a slave on a farm. He doesn't exactly look the part. One would expect him to fight one of the current guards as proof of his still very present strength, but remember, this is the pacifism manga. Thus, rather than doing the expected, Thorfinn chooses to prove his identity by taking 100 straight punches to the face without surrendering or passing out. When asked why he chose a few dozen concussions over a fight he knew he could win, Thorfinn explains it like this. What kind of question is that? Who negotiates for peace by beating a man? I've only just met you today. We don't know each other or bear each other any grudge. Why should we have to beat each other? It's foolishness. Isn't it Canute and Kittel who have a quarrel with each other? Let the two men in charge play a game of chess to settle their argument. There's absolutely no reason for so many grown men to get together and shed blood. We just met today. You are not my enemies. I have no enemies. That's not just any monologue, it's a fairly common piece of anti-war sentiment. Why does an argument between some politicians mean random people have to murder each other is the second or third line of every other political scene. Vinland Saga is about a lot of things: fatherhood, regret, culture, legacy, but Yukimura always centers it around Thorfinn's never-ending quest to create a pacifist society. Much of the series is, ironically, a war between his activism and humanity's inability to give up on violence. Vinland Saga's success in that regard is interesting though, because for every series that most people acknowledge the ideology of, there are a dozen nearly as subtle ones with huge swaths of the fanbase who refuse to believe their politics exist. Most notably, there's One Piece. Yukimura is really obvious once he gets going, but that doesn't happen for a long while. The first third or so of Vinland Saga, the entire first arc, and much of the second are, if anything, pro-war. He really takes the time to immerse you in this culture of violence, so it feels that much better when Thorfinn escapes it. On the other hand, One Piece is, among other things, largely about anti-authoritarianism and makes that really clear from the beginning. Our first major antagonist is a corrupt navy captain who rules his town with an almost literal iron fist. He then uses that control mostly to erect statues of himself and let his spoiled son execute people over rice balls. Axe-Hand Morgan is already an almost comically unsubtle critique of people in power, and the rest of the series just kind of follows in suit. From Arlong to Enel to Doflamingo to Kaido, almost all of the main villains are some form of tyrannical authority figure who the Straw Hats have to depose in the name of freedom. Quite literally, in fact, they've overthrown no less than 6 regimes just so far. Then the major antagonists who aren't independently corrupt authority figures are almost all members of the fucking world government, a globe-spanning dictatorship ruled by a slave-owning, god-complexed aristocracy called the Celestial Dragons. Hell, Luffy only wants to be the Pirate King because that person is the freest on the sea, aka the one least affected by authority. He might not spell out the importance of dual power and community organization like a true blue anarchist, but Luffy's dedication to freedom tends to look a whole hell of a lot like the libertarian left. Ichiro Oda literally wrote colonialism and global warming into this manga. His characters might not talk like they're in a zine, but he's still not subtle about his messaging. All of that obvious ideology flowing through One Piece would usually just make for a more affecting story, but it becomes weird once you check out the fandom, because there's a shocking amount of anti-intellectualism. Many of the biggest obsessives I've met, people have read all 1150 plus chapters 5 or 6 times, know the names of all 1200 or so characters, will insist that One Piece is not political at all. They'll argue that it's just this silly, uncomplicated pirate manga and you're obviously looking too far into it. As if it's a reach to say that the story where the government is evil doesn't like governments. Obviously it's more nuanced than that. I'm not trying to strawman these people. The Straw Hats befriend several benevolent royal families. The story isn't completely against the concept of authority. Fans' refusal to engage with a story that they clearly love is frustrating, obviously, but also points to something about our thesis. The tangible benefit to watching anime can clearly come in ideology, but only if you're willing to engage with that story. In order to get something besides entertainment from an anime, you do at least have to try and pick up what it's putting down. I don't expect everyone to draw a comparison between Enel and the Spanish conquistadors, but you should be able to look at that Skypiea arc and recognize that it's at least partly about colonialism. Don't write essays if you don't want to, but maybe consider annotating once in a while. On that note, well, stories like One Piece and Vinland Saga obviously put a lot of work into their themes, practically begging you to engage with them. The opposite does exist. There are tons of stories that don't ask you to engage with them at all because they're here for entertainment and just about nothing else. If these series have intentional themes, they're really obvious, uncomplicated, and clearly not the point. Sometimes a piece isn't really trying to say anything and gets what quality it has from other means. It's always important to consume a story on its own terms, and sometimes those terms don't have anything to say. It happens. Now earlier I mentioned that politics can be drawn from basically any artwork, so what about these ones? What ideology is to be aimed from a series that barely has one in the first place? A series like Solo Leveling. Look, I'm not trying to be too mean, but even its own fans will admit that Solo Leveling is just a mindless power fantasy. The show is only really there to give readers a badass character doing badass things who they can fantasize about being instead of doing their math homework. Admittedly, I never finished the series, let alone read the sequel, but by all accounts, it never gets better. Now, don't get me wrong, I've done my fair share of fantasizing about being a badass character when I was supposed to be doing my math homework. Tengen Uzui had me at chokehold for like 2 years straight. I'm not gonna shit on you for having a fantasy about a character who's made to induce them. Only difference is, even if Tengen is just largely there to be a bombastic power fantasy, Demon Slayer has a bunch of other, more plot-focused protagonists who can help pick up the slack. Solo Leveling, on the other hand, basically just has Sung Jin-woo. Sure, there's his ghost army and maybe a side character or two who can comment on how badass he's being, but that's about it. There's barely a plot here, don't come expecting themes or ideologies. However, while it seems to scorn any attempt to go beyond the base of its premise, Solo Leveling does have politics. They might not be totally intentional, which, fair enough, they're clearly not the point, but an accidental ideology is still an ideology. Think about it, a story built around dominating a world built on talent through pure hard work is extremely political. That's arguably the core of all American individualism. Sung Jin-woo's quest board allows him to pull himself up the rankings by his bootstraps, while his necromancy lets him quite literally use those around him for his own personal gain. On top of that, Solo Leveling's in-universe culture is built around strength as a stand-in for money. The strongest people around, as red hunters, are also the wealthiest. It is through their physical power that they gain monetary, social, and political power, even if they only got so strong because of luck. The quest board changes that equation, allowing Jin-woo to become the ultimate capitalist success story just by training his abs. This story would be beloved by a CEO, it's glorifying that kind of rise through the ranks. All that is a fairly surface level reading, mostly focused on the early chapters, and yet, unintentional or not, the ideology finds its way in. Solo Leveling's writer, Chugong, exists within the political structure of South Korea, so their fiction is fundamentally shaped by it, no matter the intentions. This is what people mean when they say everything is political. Even if a work of fiction isn't made with politics or ideologies in mind, it inherently reflects the ones that led to its creation. This is how any given story can provide you with ideology, even if it doesn't have one. Every last piece of art, from the Sistine Chapel to a high school garage band to JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, only exists within its context. So now, with the obligatory everything is political section done, I think we can come to a conclusion. Stories don't necessarily need purposes or tangible benefits. It's art, it'll help you however you need it to. Even if you get absolutely nothing meaningful out of reading Vinland Saga, One Piece, or Solo Leveling, you still became a better reader and expand your horizons. That has to count for something. Having said that, it's hard out there. You might as well get something out of the things you put your time into, and ideology is one of the most consistent aspects of art. Whether it's shoving it in your face or lacking anything intentional, every last story out there has at least one thing to say, and half the fun is figuring out what exactly you think that is. Who knows, if you listen closely enough, a piece of art might even change your ideology.